October 25, 1944, Tokyo, Japan. Admiral Suomu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, was receiving reports from the largest naval battle in history. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was raging across hundreds of miles of ocean. Japanese forces had committed nearly everything they had left: battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and carrier forces, in a desperate attempt to stop the American advance into the Philippines. Yet as reports arrived, a troubling pattern emerged. The Americans seemed to be everywhere. Carrier task forces operated deep inside the Western Pacific. Amphibious fleets landed entire armies on distant shores. Fuel, ammunition, aircraft, vehicles, and reinforcements continued arriving across thousands of miles of ocean. Even after years of combat, the flow showed no sign of slowing. For many Japanese naval leaders, the situation was increasingly difficult to explain. The Imperial Japanese Navy had sunk American ships throughout the war. They had struck devastating blows at Pearl Harbor. They had inflicted losses at battles from Savo Island to the Philippine Sea. Logic suggested that such losses should eventually weaken any opponent. Instead, the opposite appeared to be happening. Every offensive seemed larger than the last. Every island campaign brought more ships. Every naval battle revealed new transport fleets, new oil tankers, new cargo vessels, and new support ships. To Japanese observers, it often seemed as though the Americans possessed an endless supply of ships. What many admirals were witnessing, however, was not simply the strength of the U.S. Navy. They were witnessing the power of an unprecedented logistical system. Behind every aircraft carrier stood dozens of support vessels. Behind every amphibious landing stood entire fleets of cargo ships. Behind every task force stood shipyards, fuel depots, repair facilities, and industrial networks stretching across the United States. The battleships and carriers received the headlines, but the real story of American victory in the Pacific was happening behind them. To understand why Japanese admirals struggled to explain America's endless supply ships, we must first examine what they saw from the bridges of their own warships, and why it seemed almost impossible. In the opening months of the Pacific War, Japanese naval leaders believed they understood the strategic equation. Japan had launched a stunning series of victories. Pearl Harbor had crippled much of the American battleship fleet. The Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies fell in rapid succession. Across the Pacific, Japanese forces seized vast territories and vital resources. Many officers within the Imperial Japanese Navy believed these victories would buy time. The expectation was not necessarily that Japan could conquer the United States, but that heavy losses and long distances would eventually persuade Washington to negotiate. Geography itself seemed to favor Japan. The Pacific Ocean covered millions of square miles, and supplying military operations across such distances appeared extraordinarily difficult. Then came Guadalcanal. Beginning in August 1942, Japanese commanders encountered something unexpected. Despite fierce fighting and repeated naval engagements, American forces continued receiving reinforcements, supplies, ammunition, fuel, and replacement equipment. The U.S. Navy suffered losses, but new ships and support vessels kept arriving. The pattern repeated itself throughout the war. At the Gilbert Islands, the Marshalls, the Marianas, and later the Philippines, Japanese reconnaissance aircraft reported enormous concentrations of American shipping. Convoys crossed the Pacific in seemingly endless streams. Transport vessels unloaded troops and equipment, while cargo ships delivered mountains of supplies needed to sustain operations. What troubled Japanese admirals was not simply the size of these convoys, it was their consistency. A single invasion force was impressive enough. But after each operation concluded, another appeared, then another. Each offensive seemed supported by a fresh wave of shipping capacity. American fleets operated thousands of miles from California, Hawaii, and Australia, yet rarely appeared constrained by shortages. Japanese intelligence officers attempted to estimate how many transport ships the United States possessed. Again and again, reality exceeded expectations. To many Japanese commanders, it felt as though American logistics operated according to different rules. But the answer was not found in the combat fleet itself. The real secret lay in a vast, largely invisible armada that rarely appeared in dramatic battle reports but made every American offensive possible. When historians discuss the Pacific War, they often focus on aircraft carriers, battleships, and dramatic naval battles. Japanese admirals saw those ships too. What many struggled to fully appreciate was the enormous support fleet operating behind them. By 1944, the U.S. Navy had developed a logistical system unlike anything previously seen in naval history. For every carrier task force striking targets across the Pacific, there existed an entire network of tankers, cargo vessels, ammunition ships, repair ships, hospital ships, tugboats, and transports working continuously behind the scenes. This hidden fleet allowed combat ships to remain operational for far longer than Japanese planners believed possible. A key figure in this transformation was Admiral Chester Nimitz. Under his command, the Pacific Fleet increasingly relied on mobile logistics rather than fixed bases alone. At the same time, Admiral Ernest King pushed for aggressive offensive operations across the Pacific, confident that America's industrial and logistical strength could sustain them. The result was the creation of powerful service squadrons. These units functioned as floating support bases. They carried spare parts, fuel, food, ammunition, medical facilities, repair equipment, and maintenance personnel. Instead of forcing damaged ships to return all the way to Pearl Harbor or the American mainland, repairs could often be conducted much closer to combat zones. The effect was revolutionary. A carrier damaged in operations might be repaired and returned to service far more quickly than Japanese commanders expected. Destroyers could refuel, battleships could rearm, aircraft could be replaced, entire fleets could remain active across vast distances. To Japanese observers, the combat ships appeared tireless, but their endurance came from the thousands of sailors serving aboard support vessels that rarely attracted public attention. This logistical architecture became one of America's greatest advantages in the Pacific. Yet, even these impressive support fleets depended on something much larger. Every tanker, cargo ship, and repair vessel had to be built somewhere, and the scale of American shipbuilding would soon become one of the most important and least understood factors of the entire war. If a Japanese admiral could have toured American shipyards in 1943 or 1944, many of the mysteries of the Pacific War would have become immediately clear. The true source of America's logistical strength was not floating in the Pacific. It was being built along the coasts and rivers of the United States. Before the war, American industrial capacity was already among the largest in the world. Once mobilization began, however, production expanded to a scale that stunned friend and foe alike. Shipyards from California to Virginia operated around the clock. Workers labored in shifts that never seemed to end. New vessels slid into the water with astonishing speed. One symbol of this effort was the Liberty ship. Designed for rapid mass production, Liberty ships became the workhorses of Allied logistics. They carried fuel, food, ammunition, vehicles, aircraft components, and countless other supplies across the world's oceans. More than 2,700 Liberty ships were ultimately built during the war. Then came the Victory ships, faster and more capable vessels designed to further expand American shipping capacity. The numbers were overwhelming. The United States launched merchant vessels faster than many nations could replace losses. Even when submarines or aircraft sank cargo ships, replacements continued entering service. American production transformed shipping from a scarce resource into a strategic weapon. Japan faced a very different situation. Japanese shipyards produced excellent warships, but the nation lacked the industrial depth of the United States. As the war progressed, Allied submarines systematically attacked Japanese merchant shipping. Oil tankers disappeared. Cargo vessels were sunk. Raw materials became harder to transport between Japan and its occupied territories. The consequences were severe. Factories struggled with shortages. Fuel became increasingly scarce. Troops stationed across the Pacific often received inadequate supplies. Meanwhile, the Americans seemed able to replace losses almost indefinitely. To Japanese admirals, the contrast was alarming. Every year of the war widened the gap between the two nations' logistical capabilities. But shipbuilding alone did not explain how American fleets could operate so far from home. The next piece of the puzzle was a revolutionary approach to naval logistics that changed the nature of warfare at sea. For centuries, navies had been tied to their bases. Warships could only travel as far as their fuel, ammunition, food, and maintenance capabilities allowed. Eventually, they had to return to port. This reality shaped naval strategy throughout history. The U.S. Navy changed that equation during the Pacific War. One of the most important innovations was underway replenishment. Instead of forcing warships to return to distant ports, tankers and supply vessels met fleets at sea. Fuel hoses stretched between moving ships. Ammunition, food, spare parts, and other supplies were transferred directly in open water. The process was complex and sometimes dangerous, but it allowed American carrier task forces to remain on station for weeks or even months at a time. Japanese commanders watched with growing concern as American fleets appeared capable of operating almost anywhere. Carrier groups struck targets across thousands of miles of ocean and then quickly shifted to new objectives without returning to major bases. This flexibility was unprecedented. Another critical advantage came from floating repair facilities. Service squadrons established mobile support centers at forward locations such as Ulithi Atoll. There, damaged ships received repairs that once would have required a lengthy voyage back to Pearl Harbor or the West Coast. Ulithi became one of the busiest anchorages in the world. At various times, hundreds of American ships gathered there for resupply, maintenance, and preparation for future operations. To Japanese intelligence officers, such facilities represented an entirely new way of conducting naval warfare. The Americans had effectively created mobile infrastructure. Instead of moving fleets back to their bases, they moved the support system closer to the fleets. This logistical revolution dramatically increased operational tempo. New invasions could be launched faster, carrier strikes could be sustained longer, combat losses could be absorbed more efficiently. For Japanese admirals, it often seemed as though the Americans possessed an endless stream of ships. In reality, they had built a system that made those ships far more effective. Yet one final question remains. Why did so many Japanese leaders fail to anticipate this capability before the war even began? Before the Pacific War began, many senior Japanese leaders understood that the United States possessed enormous industrial potential. Yet understanding that fact and fully appreciating its implications were two very different things. One of the most influential voices warning about the danger was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Having studied in the United States and served as a naval attaché in Washington, Yamamoto had first-hand experience with America's economic power. He repeatedly cautioned that a prolonged war against the United States would be extremely risky. His concerns proved well-founded. Japanese war planning was built around a critical assumption. Military leaders hoped that a series of rapid victories would shock the United States and force a negotiated settlement before America's full industrial capacity could be mobilized. The strategy depended on time. If Japan could establish a defensive perimeter and inflict sufficient losses, perhaps American political leaders would decide that the cost of reconquering the Pacific was too high. What Japanese planners underestimated was America's willingness and ability to wage a long war. As the conflict continued, American factories expanded. Shipyards accelerated production. New logistics networks emerged. Training programs generated fresh crews and specialists. Every year, the gap between the two nations widened. Japanese intelligence struggled to keep pace with these developments. Reports often focused on visible combat strength, carriers, battleships, aircraft, and troop numbers. These were important metrics, but they did not fully capture the scale of the logistical system supporting them. The thousands of cargo ships, tankers, repair vessels, and supply organizations operating behind the front lines were far harder to measure. This created a dangerous illusion. Japanese commanders could count enemy warships. They could estimate aircraft production, but they often underestimated the infrastructure sustaining those forces across the Pacific. By 1944 and 1945, the consequences were impossible to ignore. American fleets operated farther, longer, and more frequently than Japanese planners had imagined. Each offensive demonstrated not just military strength, but logistical dominance. The ships seemed endless because the system producing and sustaining them was operating on a scale Japan could neither match nor effectively disrupt. When Japanese admirals looked across the Pacific in the final years of the war, they saw an ocean crowded with American ships. They saw aircraft carriers launching endless strikes. They saw amphibious fleets delivering entire armies to distant islands. They saw convoys stretching beyond the horizon. What many could not fully see was the system behind them. The apparent mystery of America's endless supply ships was never really about the ships themselves. It was about the industrial, logistical, and organizational machine that produced, operated, repaired, and replaced them. Every carrier task force depended on tankers. Every invasion depended on cargo vessels. Every warship depended on repair facilities, spare parts, fuel depots, and transportation networks. Together, these elements formed a hidden fleet that was every bit as important as the combat ships receiving the headlines. The Imperial Japanese Navy entered the war with skilled powerful warships, and impressive operational doctrine. But modern warfare is not won by combat power alone. It is won by the ability to sustain combat power over time. The United States mastered that challenge. Its shipyards launched vessels at extraordinary rates. Its logistics organizations kept fleets supplied across vast distances. Its mobile support systems allowed naval forces to operate farther from home than any navy in history. In the end, Japanese admirals were not witnessing a miracle. They were witnessing the triumph of logistics. The carriers and battleships may have won the battles, but it was the cargo ships, tankers, repair vessels, and supply networks behind them that made victory possible. And that hidden fleet became one of the most decisive weapons of the entire Pacific War.